Okay, well, it's about 1 o'clock. So hello, everybody. My name's Simon Pearson. I lead the digital and data team within the Energy Systems Catapult. And I'd like to welcome you to today, which is the first in a series of events we have this week, focused on the opportunities and challenges associated with digitalisation of the energy system. As we all know, which is, I guess, why everybody's on the call today, digitalisation is a critical component of the transformation of the energy system if we are to meet our 2050 net zero decarbonisation obligations, and also all of the things that go along with that in terms of energy efficiency, protecting consumers, etc., etc. So each day this week, we're going to focus and explore a different aspect of digitalisation and how and the part that those digitalisation techniques, tools, and approaches can play in this energy system transformation. Today's session will provide an initial update and a bit of a progress and learnings check on where we've got from the original, I guess, groundbreaking Energy Data Taskforce initiative, which ran a couple of years ago, and in June 2019 published a set of key principles, recommendations, and actions that we felt were important, in fact critical, to drive us towards a modern digital energy system. Laura Sands chaired the original Data Task Force, and it was, and you'll hear more about that later, but Laura Sands chaired the original task force and is also in fact chairing a recently launched follow-on task force, the Energy Digitalisation Task Force, which builds on the previous work and continues to drive forward our sort of collaborative approach across government, regulation, industry, and in fact all the relevant parties that have to come together to make the whole system work. Unfortunately, Laura is unable to be with us in person today, but has provided a short video introduction, followed after Richard Dobson will then run us through the findings and progress that we found to date since that original task force. I hope you find the session today both informative and enjoyable, and hopefully there'll be plenty of opportunity beyond this to get much more involved in the work itself and all of the activities that come from that. As we go on this, which will be quite an extended journey, not just the task force itself, but the whole transformation. So thank you for joining, and Tabitha, if you wouldn't mind launching the video, please.
Well, we're really proud to be publishing the first part of the 3 parts of the energy digitalisation strategy. And in some ways, it's both a look back and a push forward. Really amazing what the sector, what the regulator, and what BEIS have really driven forward, not just in the last 18 months before then, but in many ways, data and digitalisation were little islands in the energy world. And hopefully, since the Data Task Force and since all the work that everyone has been putting in over the last couple of years, those islands have grown, and we're now connecting into a much smarter system, which is extremely exciting. I hope that you will find this review very supportive of what has happened, but also, as always, because we've been, in many ways, not us, but you have been successful in taking this agenda forward, there is so much more appetite to go even faster. So look forward to your engagement with the Digitalisation Task Force, and hope that you find the analysis of what has happened since the Data Task Force useful to drive change, to deepen data utilisation and digitalisation for the benefit of the energy system, and most certainly for net zero. Thank you all so much for participating in this review.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Simon, and thanks to Laura for the introductions. I'm Richard Dobson. I'm the practice manager for data systems. I was the content lead on the Energy Data Task Force, and again working on the Energy Digitalisation Task Force with Laura to push this all forwards. So what I'm going to take you through today is some of the progress of things that have happened since the Data Task Force launched, our kind of analysis of where we think we've got to and what we think we could do slightly better, and some recommendation updates to kind of help push things a little bit further and faster. So First, to provide some context, so a strategy for a modern digitalised energy system was the Energy Data Taskforce report. It was now launched 2 years ago, but the whole process started back in kind of mid-2018, where we started to talk about the concept of a task force and why we thought it was going to work and why we thought it was needed. BEIS, Ofgem and Innovate UK came together to commission the task force in October 2018, and we spent a very busy few months doing lots of engagement with the sector, understanding what was necessary and pushing forwards a set of recommendations. And there were 5 key recommendations that we're going to walk through today, all of which that have been supported by government and the regulator and taken forward by industry in large part. So there's lots of really good progress to talk through. In terms of how digitalisation and the data task force link together, we presented a vision in the Energy Data Task Force of a modern digitalised energy system, and we saw some building blocks working towards that. Now, the Data Task Force focused primarily on infrastructure and asset visibility and data visibility, and we see these as the 2 fundamental building blocks of a modern digitalised energy system. They start to enable agile regulation, and they also start to enable innovation to come through more effectively. However, as we go forwards and digitalisation becomes more important, where digitalisation is the including digital technologies into the system, so integrating them into the energy system, and also changing to a more digital way of working, where we're utilising digital technologies to create new innovations, more efficiency in processes that already exist, but also allow us to transform new processes. And for that to really work and for that to really happen, we need to think about digital interoperability and integration. And we also need to think about the business models and markets that we start to build on top of that. And they're the next steps that we're going to be focusing on during this task force. So some overarching outcomes of things that have happened since the data task force that we wanted to flag. So firstly, energy data is a key focus across the sector. So we spoke to a number of different people as part of this review. We interviewed, I think between 30 and 40 people, don't have the number to hand, to discuss what has actually happened. But then we did a lot of background research, a lot of crawling through forums and looking at projects and project initiation forms to really understand how energy data has changed or how the attitude towards it has changed. We found that it really does hold a much more substantial place in the sector than it ever did before. I've included some quotes here from the interviews, which I found quite interesting. We've also seen that there is a much greater demand for data and digital solutions, really seeing these as potential solutions to the net zero problem and to being able to deploy a modern digitalised energy system. We've seen lots of really great work of digital and data being embedded into policy and regulation, particularly through the RIIO-2 licence conditions that are under consultation right now, but also through the Energy White Paper and other things. And we've seen some really great cross-government support for innovation more broadly, particularly the Modernising Energy Data programme, so access and applications, but also through smaller projects and through other areas where data is being integrated into areas that wouldn't have had it originally. And then finally, we've seen a huge increase in skills and data literacy. And this is not just an increase in the skills, but it's an increase in the willingness to talk about the need for these skills, the willingness to hire these skills and embed them into the organisation more broadly. Now, we have 5 key recommendations from the Energy Data Task Force, and they're on the slide right now. So digitalisation of the energy system and maximising the value of data being the 2 kind of principal level recommendations, and then 3 building blocks: the visibility of data, asset registration, and the digital system map. So what we've done is we've interviewed lots of people, we've done a lot of background research and reading to understand what's happened over the past 2 years. And we've tried to quantify the progress that's been made. An empty bar here would mean we're exactly the same place as we were when we first started the data task force. If the bar was full, that would be the vision has been fully realized. We have implemented everything we need. We don't expect any of these bars to be totally full, of course, but what we expect to see is some progress in all of them. And what we've identified is that there's been a lot of progress in some of them and a bit less in others, but there's been movement in all of them. So the first one to focus on is maximizing the value of data. This has, inarguably, it's had the biggest level of progress here. We've seen lots of data published, both openly and shared. We've seen the data best practice guidance be developed and included into the RIIO-2 license conditions that are now under consultation. And also we've seen code changes come through. The second most progress is the visibility of data, where we've seen the visibility of the Energy Data Visibility Project discovery that was run by OS and Hippo Digital make some really good findings. And then we've seen more recently BEIS moving into the alpha phase with Icebreaker 1, Hippo Digital and Arup. So there's some really good progress there, and we're expecting to see that alpha project wrap up relatively soon, which means that we'll be moving forwards with tangible deliverables and assets out the back of it. In third place, we've seen the digitalisation of energy systems, where we've got the digitalisation strategies and action plans. This again was a Ofgem initiative to voluntarily request that the networks put forward their digitalisation strategies and action plans initially, and now these are being embedded into the RIIO-2 licence as well. Fourth, we've got the digital system map, where we've seen the ENA have created some demos and commissioned some proof of concept projects. And then finally, we've got the asset registration, where BEIS have been working on research and requirements gathering to put forward a strong recommendation there as well. So now we're going to dive into each of the recommendations in a little bit more detail, walk through what's happened, the good, areas for improvement, and then what needs to be done. So recommendation 1 was the digitalisation of the energy system. This is all about trying to embed digital technologies in the system and enable it to be future-proofed. So as I said, the progress to date has been really great. We've seen digitalisation strategies and action plans, which are a very good step forwards. So all of the network organisations have put them forwards, and they're now on their second iteration of the digitalisation strategies and first of the action plan. Inclusion of the digitalisation strategies and action plans into the RIIO-2 network licence is brilliant, and we would like to see this rolled out further in other areas. We think it's a nice approach. When we spoke to people about this recommendation and the progress, there was a lot of positive. So there's a nice quote up here that says, they've come a long way. Digitalisation has become something that they're now willing to discuss rather than just pass on to the CIO. So we've seen that more people across the sector have started to engage with digitalisation as an important part of the energy system, rather than just an IT or a technology side conversation. But we also felt that there was need for more here. There was need for more leadership, more focus to help actually drive the right outcomes. So as one of the interviewees put it, that we need incredibly strong leadership, needs to be put in place urgently to make the case for rapid transformation. So we felt this quite a few times, and this is something that has led to the formulation of the Digitalisation Taskforce. The digitalisation strategies and action plans are brilliant in and of themselves. Each individually are really good, but when we put them together, we find that there are some areas of overlap, and that might mean expenditure overlap or functional. And then we're finding underlaps or gaps where things don't quite tessellate nicely. They don't quite create a whole system. And that's just the nature of artificial competition, where we're asking organisations to all develop something quickly that feels like it's a competition, but actually it's a collaboration. and we need to be pushing forwards with that collaborative approach. We're finding that there are new digital functions and roles that are starting to emerge that don't fit into existing governance structures. So really important parts of the sector, roles and responsibilities that we absolutely will be essential going forwards, and we will need them to be effective and working if the system is going to operate effectively going forwards. But we're not quite sure where they sit, and we don't know how they will be governed, and we don't know how we'll make sure that the organisations that are providing those functions are able to do that effectively in a sustainable way. So we feel like that's a bit of a gap and a bit of a challenge. And then finally, digital skills still need to improve, and more rapidly. We've seen some areas of really great progress here, but we've also seen some areas where it's not moving as fast. And this is particularly about the democratization of digital skills and data skills. It's not just about a technical expert sitting in an IT team or sitting in a strategy team. It's about having a little bit of digital skills all the way through the organization and all the way through the hierarchy in particular, making sure that there is someone on the board who understands digital and data and is able to advocate for it. So what needs to be done in this area? So firstly, the rationalization of digitalization strategies. We need to make sure that they do fit together and they come together coherently. I know that E&A are working on this in terms of network organizations, but again, we can always do more there. But there will need to be an approach that looks across the whole sector, not just networks. And then we feel there is a real need for leadership and vision of the system. So to understand where we're all aiming and what we're trying to achieve, and making sure that we understand who is responsible for what. And this is really what the Digitalisation Taskforce is here to do. So we're here to provide the vision of where we're aiming and really try and push us forwards in an effective way. Can I just say, if you do have any questions, if you want to pop them in the chat, and we'll either pick them up at the end or we'll email them out, email the answers out to everyone on the call as well. Thanks. The second recommendation was about maximising the value of data. And this in particular was about adopting the principle of presumed open. So by presumed open, we mean data should be as open as possible, unless there is a legitimate reason why that can't happen. And that could be privacy, security, negative consumer impacts, policy or regulatory blocker of some kind, or a legitimate commercial interest. So if an organization was investing in some data, investing in it with a private, non-regulated, non-monopoly action, then obviously we would want them to be able to monetize that in some way. So progress to date. Firstly, there has been a huge amount of data that's been published. We've seen that across the sector. We've seen networks publishing data, generators, code bodies, innovators, tech organizations. We've seen lots of data be published. It's still a challenge to find all of that data, and you do have to be a bit in the know to understand where to go, because there isn't a coherent way to find it all effectively. But there has been a lot more data published, and that's been a massive step forwards. Data best practice was developed, again, by the Energy Systems Catapult in collaboration with Ofgem, BEIS and Innovate UK. And that embeds the principle of presumed open, as well as a number of other principles behind data best practice. This seems to have been received quite positively by the sector. Ofgem's informal consultation at the start of the year went down at the end of last year, went down very well. And we've also anecdotally had a lot of support back from this. And the RIIO2 license and code changes that enforce presumed open across the sector are a really big step forwards. So whilst the RIIO2 license conditions are still in consultation, and hopefully that will pass through soon, we've seen the balancing and settlement code already embed presumed open into their license, with some really good sets of governance and process around it. So we're really impressed with that as well. We've also seen lots of organisations just going forward and developing their process and their guidelines around this. The ENA have done some work to coordinate across all the networks, and we saw late last week that they published the data request process, which looks really good. Quite looking forward to trying that out. And we've also seen lots of network organisations really take this forward. So WPD with the Presumed Open Data Project, but also UKPN have been doing some great stuff here, as Northern Power Grid, and lots of other organisations, too many for me to mention. And the feedback we had on this was really good. So in particular, the quote at the top there, I think is really powerful. So it's allowed us to make an offering that we wouldn't have been able to make before. We can now get to net zero and make some revenue. So innovators are actually able to develop new products and services around these data sets and really deliver value back to the sector that's going to help us get to net zero. So that's really important, and that's the goal of this ultimately, is to help us get to net zero. So we're really pleased. However, it's not all sunshine and daisies. There are some areas that haven't gone as well, and we need to push a bit further. So in particular, the quote that's on the slide saying about there's no alignment between DNOs on data formats. So whilst this isn't the first step, and we feel like data being presumed open and being published is much more important than the quality or the format initially, it does speak to the following steps where we might want to think about coordination and bringing together data into a common format so that innovators can build once and deploy many times. So other areas for improvement. So there are many useful data sets which some organisations have published and others could copy. And we think that there are data sets that can be published safely and quickly immediately. So we would like to see some of those additional ones put forwards. There is sometimes the risk of people who aren't necessarily interested in publishing data to focus on the risks of open, rather than engaging with the data triage process and thinking about what are the potential risks, how can I mitigate them effectively. They've maybe been led down the route of shared by default as such, where they would rather have much more control rather than make the data openly available, but in a slightly different format. And whilst having any data available, be it open or shared, is good, we feel there is still a lot of value in open data, and there's a lot more data that could be open if we just engage with the open data triage process slightly more effectively. And then finally, consumer data is valuable, but is a consistent challenge. It's still an area where we need to address some issues. The Smart Meter Public Interest Advisory Group have done some really great work on this. Lots of things we need to learn from that, but there are still challenges that need to be addressed. So what else needs to be done? We need to continue delivering presumed open, and this is presumed open in its most pure form. We need to be thinking about how can this data set be open? How can I mitigate the challenges around it? If I can't mitigate the challenges by manipulating the data or anonymizing it or aggregating it, then maybe I need to be thinking about shared, but starting from open where at all possible. We need to mandate the no regrets data sets that can be published openly and now. And in the report, we will be highlighting the areas where we think that's possible. And we need to provide more triage support for the sector. And this needs to be through kind of workshops or examples that show how data can be triaged effectively to identify the risks, but then mitigate them so the data can be open or shared rather than just closing it off. And then finally, we need a governance model for consumer data release, because this is really important area. It's something that we consistently see that innovators need, but we need to do it safely. We need to have those test beds, those ways of working. Things like the Smart Meter, the Smart Energy Research Lab, CERL, are really important and really valuable for academic innovators, but there isn't necessarily an equivalent in the commercial market. So on to recommendation 3, visibility of data. This was about establishing a data catalog, so providing visibility of data through standardized metadata and the ability to search and find data. Progress has been brilliant. We've seen the ONS and Hippo Digital Discovery Project that's produced some really great insights, lots of interesting outputs. And now the Alpha project is on a really good delivery timeline. We should be seeing the outputs of that very soon, or the final output of it very soon. And the ongoing work looks really positive as well. So we're very much looking forward to seeing what comes of that. Areas for improvement, things that we could have done slightly better. The delivery has been a bit slower than we think is necessary, but completely understandable. The ONS have obviously been taking a very important role within the the government's COVID response, and that obviously created some challenge for delivery on their side, and also just general procurement challenges with all of these things. Reporting and governance functions at the minute feel a little overlooked. So part of the visibility of data recommendation here was not just about providing just visibility of what I can already access. So not just open, not just shared, but about all data. And the reason for that is it gives us some really interesting governance functions to help us work out whether presumed open is delivering the benefits that we need. So we need to think about what we need in terms of the reporting and governance functions for the data catalog, and we need to make sure that we are pushing those through, because visibility creates comparisons between organizations, so we can say, are we responding in the same way to this issue? It gives data users more power to request data and to understand why they can or cannot access that data. And it also provides regulatory oversight. And we also need to focus on, we need to not only focus on open and shared data, as I said. So that's an important thing. So in terms of feedback from the interview panels, we found that on the data catalog side, the media competition and Icebreaker 1 progress has been good. So that's some really good feedback on the current Alpha project. So that's really good. But then some people flagging some interesting concerns around it needs to have a certain degree of permanence and maintenance to continue being useful. So that's an important thought about the business model and the regulatory governance model that sits around the data catalog, or the concept of the data catalog. So what do we think needs to be done? Focus on all data, visibility of all data, especially from monopoly entities, rather than the nice to have features, which are all really important, but not at the core of the recommendation. And we need to define reporting and governance requirements so that they can be delivered within the existing Alpha contract. There is a requirement within the Alpha contract to deliver reporting, but I'm not sure it's quite clear exactly what that is right now. Okay, and now on to recommendation 4, which was about the coordination of asset registration. When we set out the Energy Data Taskforce recommendations, we were thinking that asset registration was a really important part of this. We were seeing there was starting to be an explosion of asset registration portals and platforms and solutions and processes, and they weren't coordinated. They didn't share data between them, and they didn't provide a good user experience. So our recommendation was to develop a strategy to coordinate these things and bring them together. So the progress to date, BEIS have been doing a lot of research and consultation to kind of inform what the solution needs to be. And part of that is because our recommendation wasn't particularly specific in this area. And I think we could have been stronger to say exactly what we thought was most important. Areas for improvement here. Again, the Data Task Force recommendations were not specific or ambitious enough. We didn't provide a really good roadmap of what we thought was necessary. I think everybody understood what the need was, but they didn't necessarily understand what the solution was. And particularly as we went out to talk to the sector, we found that there were many different visions for what the solution could look like, and it wasn't 100% clear what needed to be rolled out. And the progress has just generally taken a long time because of that. So we've not moved as fast as we would have hoped, and that means that there's 2 years worth of data that potentially we haven't collected, or it's been collected in different silos across the sector. And ultimately, our original proposal, which, to remind everyone, was for a central catalogue or a central registration portal, has become outdated. And we think we need to go a bit further and faster to make up for the time that has passed already, but also to be more future-proofed and develop something that's actually useful. Again, we found in our interviews that generally there were a lot of people who were supportive of this recommendation still, and still flagging that this was an ongoing issue. It wasn't the top priority for many of the people in the interview process, but it was still important to them. And actually, there were some people who were quite directed in this area. So particularly those who are involved in operation of the system more broadly were quite strong to say, actually, this is a really important asset. This is a really important thing for us. And it has to be driven by much firmer regulation and registration, and also a common approach to registration more broadly. So what needs to be done? So we think that we need to come back to basics to start with. We need to deploy an energy asset register. This isn't a registration strategy, this is a register, a list of assets which are on the system, very similar to something like the embedded capacity register, but with a much more wide-reaching remit. Now, we think bringing it back to basics means that this can be deployed relatively quickly, and we can start to get visibility of what data exists, bring it into a central location, and provide those who really need this data to unlock their business models or operate the system effectively. We give them access to data sooner rather than later. But then, instead of thinking about a registration approach, we start to think about auto-registration and really thinking about future-proofing this. So we think the next steps are to specify an auto-registration solution, which enables assets to securely register with the Energy Asset Register. And I do apologise for already putting a acronym in for that. So I won't use that, I promise. And we think that auto-registration is really important because the number and the variety of assets that are going to start being on the system, and not necessarily permanently on the system, is going to increase massively. And if we're going to have an up-to-date version of which assets are on the system, live and ready to go, we're going to need to think about auto-registration. It's just not going to work otherwise. So we need to specify what the solution looks like. And then we need to be thinking about what standards and contracts can be used to mandate that all new energy assets auto-register. We think 2023 is a sensible line in the sand for something like this. But really what we're talking about is, firstly, setting out what our register should look like. So what does the data set look like? Secondly, an auto-registration process that enables equipment manufacturers and asset manufacturers more broadly to start developing to that standard, and then putting a line in the sand to say, at this point, we need you to be doing this. This is a mandatory requirement. And that starts to give us visibility of assets across the sector. And finally, the digital system map. So this is very much in the heart of visibility of infrastructure and assets, the second layer of the building block diagram that I showed right at the start. Now, the progress to date has been good. We've seen the ENA take on ownership of this, and particularly the Digital Data Steering Group, what was the Digital Data Working Group, have taken a lead on this, and they led a digital system map demonstration, and they're now procuring a proof of concept solution So there's some really good progress here, and there's also been a lot of good conversations in the background to think about interoperability of network data, how we can actually put all of this data onto a map in a coherent, meaningful way. So areas for improvement here. The main thing we found from the interviews here was that people were not aware of what was going on within this group. Unless they were part of the working groups or they had a good relationship with those within it, they didn't feel like they knew what was going on. And that means that people don't think it's moving as quickly as it is, or they aren't aware of the movements that are happening. So we think, firstly, we really need to focus on better communication with stakeholders, really projecting what is happening in this project. We know it's not simple, we know it's not a trivial project to deliver, but it's important to tell people where we're going and how it's happening. And also what they should be expecting from the solution. Because there is some really great work going on to actually deliver something, but some people were unsure about what they would actually be able to use within that system. Will it just be a simple visualization? Will there be data access from the back of it? Will it be commercially available, or will it be free? There were lots of different questions, and I think most of them have answers, but we need to make sure that they're accessible. And then delivery of a publicly accessible solution. And this leads us on to the first of the kind of what needs to be done recommendations. So the first one is to deploy the public beta solution. This doesn't have to be complete, it doesn't have to be finished, it is a beta, but we really think it's important that it's out there in the public so people can use it, give feedback, understand what their requirements are and feed that back in. We definitely need greater transparency, so just tell stakeholders about the progress that's happening, project that a little bit more, and also learn from other mapping exercises. So there's been some great work in Northern Ireland, Australia, with the Electrolink Flexa project, and so on and so on. There's many other good mapping exercises that have happened already that can be either built on or we can learn from the process. In terms of the interview feedback here, we found that actually if people had been involved in this group and the work going on here, they were really complimentary of the group working on it. They felt like the right people were in the right rooms delivering the project. But then there was just a lack of understanding that this existed. And that's a loss, really, because if those people are engaged, they might be able to contribute to the project more broadly. Now, I've reached the end of my main slides. So if anyone has any questions that they would like to raise, I think we've got a few in the chat already. But if you would like to add anything else in there, I'd be, very happy to take them.
Richard, I've pulled out a few as we've gone along.
Fantastic.
There's been quite a few. I'll read a couple out and you can take them if that's all right.
Fab.
So first one, which is about views on how much centralisation of digital systems will be needed.
So I think this probably falls more into the digitalisation task force rather than the data task force review. In terms of the need for centralisation, I would say is, I guess, relatively low. It's not an essential solution. So there are many ways to deploy these in decentralized formats. What we're seeing is that there are areas where there may be natural digital monopolies. So there may be areas where it's just most efficient to deploy this as a single digital solution. And in which case we need to get the governance right around it. But as we're very aware, there is a decentralized process happening in the energy sector right now, moving from small number of large generators and large energy suppliers, shippers, to a much larger number of distributed assets. So we're already seeing that start to happen on the energy asset side. I can't imagine we're going to see the opposite happening on the digital side quite so much.
Okay, another question was around, you touched on in the slides, but open data in the context of smart meter consumer data, which is heavily consent based, and how does that play with the open data context generally?
Yeah, so within the concept of presumed open, we talk about there are a number of good reasons why data might not be open. You might not be able to make it open. One of those is privacy. So that might be a reason or something that restricts data being 100% open. But that doesn't mean that none of the data can be open. It means that the raw disaggregated data can't be. If you were to aggregate that up, so for example, aggregating it up to substation level, it becomes much less sensitive in terms of privacy, because you're very unlikely to be identifying a single individual when you're at a substation level. There's always exceptions. So, but what we've seen within the smart meter PAG is that there are areas where data needs to be available, smart meter data needs to be available to government for decision-making purposes and to local authorities. But we're also seeing from innovation projects and innovators that there is a need for process smart meter data that develops better better profiles, energy profiles that can be used to manage contracting of different things. So we're really, I guess we're talking about a wide range of solutions here, some of which are purely open, and that might be aggregated smart meter data, and some of which perhaps shared because it can't be aggregated, it needs to be at an individual level, but the value isn't there if it's not. So.
Okay. There was another question around whether the national data strategy helps or hinders with the initiative in terms of digitalisation of the energy system.
I think broadly it's helping. So we spoke to the National Data Strategy team a lot after we're developing their process, and we've spoken to Bays and the Better Regulation Executive about how we can reuse some of the recommendations we put forwards here. So I think there's some really good ways that it supports, but it's much wider. So it's thinking about across many different sectors and across government as well. And as we think about energy becoming less centralised in terms of just the energy sector, we're now thinking about EVs, and we're thinking about heat systems, and we're thinking about how we can integrate with building technologies. Actually, we do need to be aware of and part of the national data strategy within energy to help push us forwards.
Okay, there was a question around the balance between presumed open data and then commercial entities and protection of IP related data. You touched on the triage process during the presentation, but maybe a quick expansion on that.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, it all comes down to the open data triage. So we're not saying that all data needs to be open full stop. We're saying that data should be presumed open, and we should work backwards from that. Commercial interest is one of the areas where we believe there is a legitimate reason for data to not be open. I was speaking to an innovator this morning on exactly this topic. If private investment is going into technologies which are collecting data that are not monopoly actions, they're not a regulated or a mandated role within the sector, then there is definitely a role for commercial interest and therefore intellectual property or protection of any kind. However, if we're talking about monopoly actors, we're talking about privileged access to collect data or to own that information, then we need to be thinking about how we share that. And that's a question of how do we get to net zero effectively in the most efficient way. And that's about sharing information, about making sure it works for everybody.
Okay. Another question was around data quality issues with open data. The question referenced network companies, but I think it's a generic question about, if data is made openly available, what about the quality and provenance of that data, and how is that coordinated or monitored?
So this is one of the governance processes that we hope to see integrated into the data catalog or the visibility of data project. So firstly, quality shouldn't be a reason why data isn't published. So we do always prefer to have some data that's poor, that's not as good quality, than having no data at all. What's poor quality for one application might be fine for another application. But what we need to see is a feedback mechanism. So if data is published, it's poor quality, and everyone wants to use it, then we need to make sure that that's fed back to the networks or to any organization that's publishing that data, and they're able to improve it over time. Within the RIIO-2 guidance, within data best practice, the network organizations in this context would be asked to improve the quality of their data, prioritizing their user needs. If there are no users, there's no point spending any time and effort to improve the quality, or if there are no prospective users. But we do need feedback, and that's what the data catalog needs to be providing, a mechanism to feedback and to coordinate that feedback to the originator of that data.
Okay, and I'm conscious of the fact you've been on the floor now for 45 minutes, so two more questions, and then I think we'll probably look to close there. There's a question around considering national security issues for publishing some of the data, for example, maps of the energy system infrastructure and assets, and how's that's been considered?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as we said, security is a good reason why you might not publish data. So we do need to think about that, and that it is really important. We are thinking about a piece of critical national infrastructure in the energy system. However, we need to think about security in an incremental risk way, and we need to think about it in quite a modern way. Long gone are the days where we can ensure security by hiding things. We have Google Maps, we have Google Satellite, Street View. You know, there are many digital tools and digital systems out there which have kind of made it much more easy to go and find information across the system. And we think that you could say you can't publish anything and you can't show anything because of security, but you're blocking a huge amount of innovation there, and you're also potentially risking our transition to net zero by not allowing that data to be shared. If it really is too sensitive to be published openly, then it can be shared with the right process around it. But the vast majority of things like you know, high and medium voltage network maps, they are relatively low risk in terms of security. They're already known about. National Grid have been publishing the transmission network maps for a very long time. You can Google search grid supply points and you will find them on a map. It's really not that difficult. So we need to think about what's the balance between incremental security risks and trying to unlock innovation and reach net zero. So it's a bit of a balance here. In terms of our digitalisation task force, we're working with the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure and also reaching out to lots of other security professionals to help us scope and present the right recommendations in terms of security. Because obviously control is different to data as well.
Okay, and one last question for you. And again, there are obviously a number of other questions in here, too many to go through here, so we will respond to all of these. And this again is many of these actually are questions more about the new task force rather than the data task force. It's around the Ofgem's consultation on DSAP, which talks about provisions for digitally excluded stakeholders, and the question is, does the new task force consider that? You know, is that something it will look at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anything when we're talking about data and digital systems, it's always easy to think about the benefits and the wins and not think about the challenges. And the digitally excluded are one part of society that could potentially not benefit if we don't think about it with digital systems. There's also things like fuel poverty and those who are just more vulnerable more generally. So we have to think about these, and this is absolutely within the scope of the Digitalisation Task Force, and it's a big part of the governance focus, because what we're not looking to do is just make it the Wild West and everyone, fight for yourself. We're trying to make sure that we get the benefits of digitalisation without creating the risks and the challenges around that. There's some really interesting work going on in the Catapult right now about particularly fuel poverty, but the excluded from the energy system more broadly. The project Involve with BEIS, which is really interesting. I think I've just published another report, so that might be worth looking at. But yeah, we're really interested, and we're going to be working with with citizens' advice on this as well, to make sure that we're really understanding the issues and dealing with them effectively, rather than just kind of glossing over them.
Okay, well, I think that's probably enough of the question and answer session for the moment. Any questions that we've not picked up, we will pick up and respond to. In the closing section, are there any other points you want to raise, Richard, or if people have queries afterwards, the process by which they might be able to ask them?
Yeah, so I guess just to wrap up, I think we'd say that when we published the Energy Data Taskforce report, we couldn't have imagined how much progress would happen in just 2 years. We've had the Energy White Paper, we've had hard license conditions coming out of Ofgem, we've had code bodies picking it up, we've had networks publishing data and putting in processes, we've had generators, trade bodies, so many different organizations picking up the recommendations and really running with them. So I guess it's just a massive thanks to everybody who's been delivering on the vision that we were talking about 2 years ago. It's really important for us that this is a collaborative effort. We are all working towards this together. As we move forwards with the Digitalisation Task Force, we're going to need to collaborate and work with everybody in the sector all over again, because this is a different beast, it's a different challenge. So if you do want to get involved with this, there's an email address on the slide just there, so please just drop us a line. But also, contact me directly or any of the team who are working on this, and just, be open and tell us the challenges, tell us where you think there's opportunities. We're trying to unlock the sector, make it more digitalized, and really try and deliver the vision of a modern digitalized energy system kind of once and for all. But yeah, just thanks very much for your time, everyone, and thank you for listening. I hope to speak to you all over the coming months with the Digitalisation Task Force.